Good morning. I am Robert Metzger, Chairman of the Board for Fort Klock. Today we are going to do a brewing demonstration and a baking demonstration. We have here some of our reenactors and brewing experts. Here we have Harvey, brewer. We have Lisa, who's a reenactor and helper. We have Kevin.
I'm an apprentice.
And he's the apprentice brewer. And Bill. Bill is also a member of the board here at Fort Klock.
Okay, we are starting now to brew beer, which is something that was very common in colonial period. Most of the brewers were actually connected in one way to a miller. And the main reason for that was that there wasn't a whole lot of cash, and usually if you were a miller, you would get your payment in kind. Typically 10% of whatever you ground would become yours. So now you have to figure out a way of making something that is commercially feasible. So one of the things you would do, if you're reading about it, you'll find that millers either they own a brewery, their brother-in-law is a brewery, or they have a partner, something along those lines. So what we're doing today then is we're starting out with what is called malt. And malt is going to be a grain which has been wetted and caused to sprout, and then after it sprouts, it's going to be killed with heat. Okay, now most of what you're going to be doing is going to be this light colored material, but for flavor, you can let a little bit of it be what they call toasted, which is where you're going to get your ambers. Or if you want a dark beer, you're going to char it a little bit, and that's where your porters and stouts come from. Today, I'm going to be brewing a porter. So I have about 14 pounds of the light-colored barley and then 1 pound of the charred, just enough to give it a little bit of flavor. So if we come over here to our pot, what we've done is we've put our malted barley into the pot, and we're now cooking it over the fire at a relatively low temperature. About we don't want it to go beyond about 120 degrees centigrade, and Fahrenheit. And what we're doing here is there's an enzyme in the malted barley that converts starches into sugars. So what we're going to be doing then is for a couple of hours, because I cannot control heat all that well. So we're going to do it at a much lower temperature than they would have done there. If you look at their recipes, they generally would be about 200-300 gallons at a time. And when you do that, what they would do is they would bring it up over temperature, wait for it to get down to the right temperature, and then they would start to brew the beer. And for the hour and a half that they are going to need, the temperature isn't going to change very much. Okay, I can't do that, obviously, with just 5 gallons. So what I do is I brew it at a much lower temperature for a longer period of time. Okay, now this is going to affect the flavor, which means that when I make beer, it's not going to be exactly the same every time. And that's the big difference between a master brewer and either an amateur or someone that's just starting out. When we're talking about beer, we really need to make sure that we have the same sort of definition. So for today, when I say beer, I'm going to say any type of fermented grain. So that obviously negates root beer, birch beer, things like that, which have common usage there. So in this case then there are going to be 4 ingredients that we have to have, and that's going to be the malted barley, the yeast, the water, and then finally hops. And hops are actually a flower that grow on a vine, and if we look at the flower and go in there, you can see the yellow pollen in there. This is what's really important. This is going to not only give flavor to the beer, which is certainly something we want, but it is also antibacterial. And what we don't want to have happen is have bacteria get in which case it's going to produce acetic acid instead of the alcohol and carbon dioxide that we want. So we're going to be at some point adding the hops to our beer after we have converted the starches into sugars. Now, there are a lot of other ingredients that can also go into beer, and just like any craft brewing, if you're doing today, there are all sorts of things that you can do. So you can do ginger, you can do molasses, etc., etc. Today I'm going to be putting in a little bit of licorice. So this is licorice root before it becomes a condiment, and we simply grate it, and then we'll get a little bit more here. And you can see we're starting to get the licorice coming out. It takes a while to grind an entire root like this, but we've got plenty of time because we have to wait a couple of hours for the malted barley to come anyway. And also, like they do today and for commercial beers, in addition to the barley, if you have something that's cheaper than the barley, you'd rather put that in. Today, that is mostly rice or corn syrup. But back in colonial times, what was really cheap was molasses. So I'm also going to throw in some molasses into our finished product as well. But again, everything except the 4 ingredients that I talked about would be optional depending on the brewer. And again, you see all kinds of recipes for different types of things being put in. We have now put the grain in with the water, and we've kept it simmering for about 2.5 hours this time. Again, it would have been a much shorter time if we could control the temperature. And now they are going to move it over to the sparging buckets here. And this is really just a giant colander. You can see the holes. And so what we're going to do is we're going to spoon the grains into this. And then you can see that other pot there, that has boiling water in it. And we're going to pour that boiling water through there. And that's going to pick up all the sugars and such and have the liquid then. And the liquid at this point is called wort. And it actually tastes pretty good, but there's no alcohol in it yet. So this is just one step in the process. So we see, where's the ladle? Here it is. Our ladle, and we'll start moving our grain with the water into the sparging bucket. And you can hear it. With a nice liquid draining out into our boiled the wort, or simmered the wort, and now we are going to put it, after we've strained it, we're going to put it back in the pot. And now you can see it's much lower and it's over some serious coals now, so what we're going to want to do is actually boil this. And this is where we're going to be adding the hops and the any flavorings that we want to put into it. Can you want me to help you there?
I think we got it.
Okay, so, and we have to do it fairly slowly.
Yeah, you want to help. I think I need some help there.
Because we're straining this out, so we can't just dump it in. There are holes at the here, so we're getting all the big pieces strained out. We might want to stop it now. Okay, we're now ready to add the flavorings in the yeast. So here's the molasses that I talked about. Again, molasses are relatively cheap, so you're going to use quite a bit of these. Rinse it around. And then we also have our hops and the liquors that we grated out. And we'll add those. And now we're going to let this boil for about an hour so we can infuse those flavors into it. And would you hand me the dipper there, please?
Absolutely.
Definitely molasses.
Make sure it's clean. Or as clean as we can make it.
Well, we're going to be straining it again, so it's not that important. So we're going to let this boil now. So we'll do this for about an hour.
You can smell the hops right now.
Yes, you can. Okay, so now we let this boil for about an hour. And then the next thing we'll do is we'll throw in some hops. It's called finishing. We'll just do that for the last 4 or 5 minutes, and that's strictly for flavor. Right now we're interested more in boiling the hops to get the antibacterial material out there. So this is what gives beer that sort of bitter taste. Okay, now in this bucket we have what's called the spent grain, and this is the grain that has gone through and been strained out. But in colonial times they don't waste anything, so what we would do is we would take this and pour more boiling water through it. So that's going to pick up some of the flavors and sugar, but we're going to add a lot more molasses to this. So, and this would be a lower alcohol, not as tasty, and they call it small beer. And it's extremely high calories. So not what we have these days along those lines.
One thing, if I might add here, is that the molasses we add, molasses are a byproduct of sugar making. So molasses are cheap. They're an industrial waste product in a sense. So that's being shipped into the colonies very inexpensively from the islands after extracting the refined sugar. So
Now,
it's a cheap product. This is hot, so we'll keep it level. How close?
right by where it was before. That's perfect. Right there. Okay. All right. Good. Got it now. Pour this in. Good stuff.
Are you going to add the extra?
Yeah, and then what I'm going to do. Okay, so now we're just going to throw some extra ones on.
For flavor.
And stir it up. And then about okay, so now what I'm going to do is as soon as I clean this out, then we can actually strain it. As I hope you noticed, when we took the pot off the fire, I threw a handful of hops into it. Those are called finishing hops, and the volatiles and such in them are going to be used strictly for flavoring. In other words, when we talk about hopping, there's actually 3 things you can do. You can boil it, which you have to do. And then if you want to, you can throw in some finishing. And what you can do, but we're not going to do, is you can also what's called dry hopping, which means you're going to put the hops directly into the fermentation vat and not strain it out. As far as I can tell, in colonial times, I've not seen a reference of dry hopping yet. What happened was in the 18th century, they learned that if you jacked up the alcohol and really increased the hops, you could ship it all the way to India and it would still be something people are willing to drink. And that's what we have for IPA, stands for India Pale Ale. So, but again, that is a 18th century, 19th century, not an 18th century phenomenon. Also, as far as the hops go, there are a lot of old types of hops, but most of the newer varieties have a very high acid content and a very different type of flavor. So if you're trying to make a colonial brew, As far as the malt goes and yeast goes, now certainly if you go to a store and you say you want to make beer, they're going to have all kinds of different malts, all kinds of different hops, all kinds of different yeasts. And this is true also for cooking. If you look at actual references, though, they assume anybody who is going to go to the trouble of looking at a recipe already knows what they're doing. Okay, plus the fact that yeast is going to be whatever you happen to happen, hops happen to be whatever you have happen. So it will simply say use this much malt, this much yeast. They figure that you're a good enough brewer that you know what to do in terms to make the kind of flavor that you like. On the other hand, I have found a letter that Philip Schuyler wrote to one of his friends thanking him for the hop rhizomes that he sent. So that says we know he was already brewing beer. So by conjecture, that tells me that they did have different varieties of hops, and apparently one of his friends had a variety he thought was really good and sent that over to General Schuyler. So a lot of what we're doing is by conjecture. So what we're going to do now, as you can see, we're straining this out. You can see we're straining out the hops from there. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pour it into a fermentation keg. This is called kegging. And then after it is cooled down, we will add the yeast, and that will let the stuff ferment. And depending on temperatures and things like that, it'll take anywhere from 2 to 7 days. And what you're going to do is you're going to keep going until it stops fermenting and bubbling. Okay, we have now boiled the hops and the flavors in with the wort. So now we are pouring it into our fermentation keg, and we're going to do what's called kegging it. So once we've poured it, what we'll do is we'll seal the top, and we'll put in what's called a fermentation lock. And this would have been made of glass, and you put a little bit of water in with it, and this means then that the carbon dioxide coming through is going to bubble out, but it's not going to allow oxygen to come in. When people talk about skunky beer, what that is that oxygen one way or another has gotten in. This is why when you open your beer, you go the next day, it doesn't taste all that good. So we'll put our fermentation lock in then, and we'll let it go for, again, depending on temperature, somewhere between 2 and 7 days generally. And when it gets cold like this, I use what's called a lager yeast. And if it's a little bit warmer in the summer, where my basement's a little bit hotter, then I'll put in what's called an ale yeast. And once that happens, then you've got your beer. Now, modern day people they like to bottle it. I'm too lazy for that. I keep it in the keg, and I have a dedicated refrigerator in my basement that will hold the keg. And if you come to any of our events, usually what I will do is, since it takes a few days for us to actually have beer, I generally will have a keg that I made the last event that we had, or in the case of if you come to the Taste of New York next year, hopefully we'll have that again. I always have a batch that I've made for people to send. That does it for that.